Hello, welcome to Meet the Author. I'm Louis Meyers, the host, and this is the show where we talk with authors about their books, about the writing process, and whatever else might come to mind. We are excited today to have with us Christopher Shaw Myers, who is with us by Zoom from his home in Fairfield, Connecticut. As you can see, Christopher is related to Robert Shaw, the great playwright and movie actor who we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about this very interesting book he's written. But let me tell you first about Chris. Chris grew up listening to the stories told by his colorful uncle, Robert Shaw, and other family members. Born and raised in Pennsylvania, he attended Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, where he double majored in English literature and mathematics, and then went to Columbia University, where he received a master's degree in business administration. After a 30-year career in the high-tech field, he delved deeper into his family's history to explore the magic that Robert and his siblings cultivated in their lives. And Chris, welcome to the show. Appreciate you being here. I should say by way of disclaimer that I also attended the same college, and we were on campus together for 3 years, although we don't think that we ran into each other too often, but I'm glad to talk with you now. So this is, of course, the 50th year anniversary of the movie Jaws. Certainly a timely time to look back on some of the colorful characters who made up that movie, and perhaps most especially your uncle Robert Shaw. But we're going to talk about him, but a good part of the book, early part of the book, looks at his family, his parents, and of course your mother, Joanna, who is his sister. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about each of them, because I think that clearly it influenced Robert Shaw, and these were fascinating people in their own right. Would you start for a minute talking about his mother, who was quite a character?
Yep, I call her Mrs. Shaw in the book. I personally called her Oma. Oma is Dutch Afrikaans for grandmother. And by the happenstance of her birth, her father was stationed in South Africa when she was born. So she spent the first 4 or 5 years of her life in Swaziland in South Africa, and always liked being called Oma. Yeah, she was a character, but she was a very sort of regal British woman, very proper. And so Mrs. Shaw was how she liked to be addressed. And she was one of the scariest people I've ever met in my life, Louis. She terrified me as a child because she could be so critical of anything you did. But at the same time, a minute later, she'd have you laughing out loud at something else that she said. So she was just one of those, characters. She had a big character. The joke within the extended Shaw family is if you asked who's got the biggest character in the Shaw family, outside of the family, everybody would say Robert Shaw, right? He was the famous one. He was the actor. But inside the family, we all know that Oma, Mrs. Shaw, had the biggest personality. She took over a room as soon as she entered it, and she didn't let it go.
In your descriptions of her, she reminded me a little bit of the Maggie Smith character in Downton Abbey, who had that same effect and that same sort of approach to life. And she grew up in a time, really almost the end of the Victorian era, and one got the sense in reading about her that had it been a different era, given her intelligence and her determination, that she might have been had a different sort of life path herself.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, everybody in her era was, a wife and mother, right? And she was also a nurse, and she did some things like that. But she was born into the middle class and thought that she was marrying into the upper class when she married a wealthy doctor. It turned out he was also a very, I would guess, depressed alcoholic who almost, ruined her life.
Let's
But
talk
again,
about this. So we're
her
talking now
strength
about, of
just
course,
pulled
Robert
everything
Shaw's.
through.
I'm sorry. We're
I'm
talking
sorry.
about Robert Shaw's father.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
tell us a little, 'cause obviously a big influence on his son, but tell us a little bit about him because he was also a fascinating guy.
Yeah. So, my grandmother I knew very well. She lived till she was 94 years old. So I knew her well. My grandfather, I didn't know at all. He died when Robert, my uncle, was 12 years old and my mother was 9 years old. So I just know about him from my grandmother and from Robert and others in that family. Yeah, he was a very, very charismatic man. He could tell just he was the life of a party, right? And that can be good and bad. And I think that, the good is that he's just so much fun to be with, and the bad was that he was drinking a lot at those parties. But he was a storyteller. He was a person who could do different accents, and he could talk about his experience in World War One and move from what it was like to be with the Italians versus the Germans and go from one accent to the other. And clearly, Robert took that part of his personality from him, took the storytelling from him, and then the toughness he got from his mother. So a combination of those two.
But he was also a remarkable physician.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I don't know about remarkable, but he was a successful physician. I think his drinking it's is what ended his practice, right? His patients could no longer rely on him and stopped calling on him. But until then, yes, he was a successful physician. Went to a great school in London, and and you know had his practice in both England and then in the Orkney Islands, where they moved when Robert and my mother were children.
And unfortunately, it sounds as if he died either through suicide or through a mixture of alcohol, unintentional mixture of alcohol and morphine. It was not clear from the book, or perhaps no one really knew.
It was ruled a suicide.
Was ruled
Uh,
suicide.
it was ruled a suicide by the judge at the inquest. Um, You know, it's an interesting thing. I did not lose my parents when I was a child, right? My mother, by the way, Robert's younger sister, is still alive. She's 95 years old.
God bless her.
My father passed away 10 years ago, but I had him all through, my life. Um, it's an interesting thing when children lose a parent. And if that parent is a loving, mature, healthy parent, the children will mourn, but they'll take away good things for the rest of their life. It's very, very different when your father is ruled to have committed suicide. Then there is a stigma attached to the family. And I grew up wondering what happened to my grandfather. I didn't hear I heard various things. I didn't hear that he had committed suicide until I was an adult. And perhaps, that's what a parent does. My mother shielded me from that. Um, but there was, it was a difficult thing for Robert Shaw and his siblings to grow up with. And the way my mother tells it, unless somebody else has been through something very, very similar, you can't even really talk to them. Nobody really gets what they went through. That's a tough thing. And Robert had to live with that all his life. I don't ever remember talking to him personally about it, but I've seen him interviewed on some of the old interviews, and he was pretty straightforward about it. Um, so maybe he dealt with it a little better than some of the others. I'm not sure.
Their growing up years, Robert and his siblings, your mom included, was a little bit peripatetic. They moved from place to place several times.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about some of the places they lived and how you think that may have influenced Robert Shaw.
Yeah. So when I when I talk to people about what the book is about, I talk about what I call the hidden figures in Robert Shaw's life. And you've already touched on some of them, Louis. His father and his mother, my mother. My mother was his best friend from a very early age and all the way through. In fact, when my mother um, called me up, I was 21 or 22 years old at the time, to tell me that Robert had died. It was the only time I ever heard her cry in her entire life, right? She had that British stiff upper lip. So the hidden figures in this book are the very, very strong women in his life, his mother, his sisters, his father also. And but then to your point, the other people that really influenced him, and which I try to describe in the book, are the people in the Orkney Islands off the northern coast of Scotland. That's where they spent, Robert was about five and about when they moved there, and about 12 when he left, right? So, the early years. And then the teenage years were spent in Cornwall. So they lived on the very northernmost part of Britain, basically off the northern coast of Scotland for the first 6, 7, 8 years of their lives. And then their teenage years in the very, very southernmost part of Cornwall. And the people in those places are actually, they may disagree with this, but from my perspective, they're similar because they're Celtic. The Celtic, the Celts in Great Britain who were sort of pushed out of the main part of Great Britain, 1,000 years ago, and they migrated into northern Scotland and Wales and Ireland and southernmost Cornwall. And those parts of Great Britain are still very Celtic by nature. So there's a lot of the Celt in Robert Shaw and the Shaw family. And yeah, I try to describe what those people were like in the book. I've spent many summers in both Scotland and Orkney and in Cornwall. So I have a feeling for it. And then talking to my mother and, my aunts and uncles about what it was like growing up there, that's all there in the book.
Well, he had a rather, I won't say unsupervised childhood, but he, like many children of that era, he was allowed to go out and play, and there was no helicopter parents particularly supervising every moment of their day.
Yeah, quite the reverse. Exactly. They were allowed to roam the countryside, and parents, I guess, in those days never thought too much about it. Um, and that freedom, and especially in the very remote parts of Britain, the Orkneys and Cornwall, um, where the hiking paths through, cow pastures and, corn or whatever they grow in the fields in Britain. You could just walk and hike for miles, and they loved to do that. And
Yeah,
especially in
somewhat
Cornwall,
idyllic,
where they
but
lived near the water and they could hike along the cliffs.
it was somewhat idyllic. But beneath all of this, of course, there's his father's drinking, and then the changed economic, financial situation of the family. They went from being, I suppose, with a father who was a successful physician, being one of the wealthier families in the district, in the town, to then being at loose ends, just financially, it sounds like.
Yeah, they went from riches to rags.
Yeah,
They were
and
part of the
essentially
upper
had to move in
class.
with this family and sort of merge their family with another family more for financial reasons.
Yeah,
Do you think
exactly.
that the financial insecurity affected your uncle as he grew older?
Um, that's a good question, Louis. I hadn't really thought of it that way. Um, they grew up first of all, during the Depression, and which was global, and then during the war. And to some extent, the World War II, which began right around the time when their father died, and they were plunged into poverty. Um, to some extent, uh, that saved them from the stigma of being poor because everybody was in it together at that
That's
point.
true.
The rationing, and one of the things about World War II was that it really, I think, uh, ended the British, um, you
Class
know,
system.
being the leader of the world, and it ended a lot of the sort of Britain is a very class structured society, and but in World War II, the rich and poor alike, were in the ration lines together. Were taking in evacuees from London. Everybody was in it together. And following the war, the British Empire ended, right? all, India and many other countries that they had controlled declared independence. And I think that class structure, changed quite dramatically also, all in, following World War II. So yes, Robert and his family were very poor, and very suddenly, but I don't think it felt that way to them. They were in a war at that point. What they did feel though, Louis, is that again, although you know, my grandmother thought that my grandfather killed himself accidentally, right? But that wasn't the ruling. And so he was lowered into a pauper's grave because no church would take somebody who had taken their own life. So the Shaws were literally paupers by definition, at that point. And yeah, again, in a class conscious society like Great Britain, that was a little tough to take.
The the other person I wanted to talk about is, of course, is your mother, Joanna, who, as you've already said, was Robert's best friend from an early age, not just his sibling, but his best friend, his confidant. She is a remarkable woman, lady, your mother. In reading the book, I almost think there should be a book about her, but I guess in a way you've written it. Um, Tell us a little bit about her and, of course, South Africa and sort of her life path.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and ironically, when I began writing this book, I I had Robert Shaw in mind, but I approached my mother about 10 years ago. That's how far back this goes. And I said, I'd like to, write the story of your life. And she thought about it for a moment and she said, no, nobody will be interested. So I played a scenario for her and I said, look, let me just sort of map out how I think, why the book might be of interest. So Louis, we've already talked about her mother and father, right? So, and the childhood and how, the Orkney Islands and Cornwall in World War II. So there's that. And then she was one of the first women to attend Cambridge University back in the late 40s, early 50s, when very, very few women were there. And women just, were pursuing that kind of a career in general. She went from there to South Africa to fight apartheid, met with Nelson Mandela, gave him her views on what he needed to do to end apartheid. Um,
Yeah,
he was thrown
can I
in jail
stop
for
you for a
30
minute?
years
I want
following
you to
that,
talk,
but
Chris. I want you to talk about the South African interlude because that is. I was just amazed to read what she did and how dangerous it was, what she was doing and what she was participating in. Can you tell us a
yeah.
little bit about that?
Yeah, so she worked for a mission school, a college. It's called Adams College in Pietermaritzburg and outside of Durban. And so the mission schools had originally come to South Africa to bring Christianity, right, to the Black Africans. But then several of the schools transitioned in the era of apartheid to teach Black Africans in the same curriculum as the white schools were teaching. And the reason for that is that the government was giving standardized tests to both white students and Black students. But these tests were all designed for the white curriculum. So the Black students were failing those tests. And the government was saying, you see, they're inferior. That's why we need to have apartheid. So the mission schools like Adams were fighting that by teaching the Black children with the white curriculum. And then they were doing equally well. And, they were progressing and becoming, leading politicians like Adam Luthuli and others. Um, so, so that's what she was doing. But, and when she was there in the 1950s, for a white woman, it was a very safe place uh, to be, right? A white government was in control, and but the her colleagues were a mixture about 50-50 of white and Black, and the Black people that she was interacting with, were leading a very different life. And she dated, one Zulu, a black man at that time, right? She was in her 20s, so was he. And he broke it off because he said, if anybody ever sees us together, I'll be thrown in jail and tortured for the rest of my life. So that's the kind of environment she was at in the 50s. She went back a couple of other times, one just after apartheid had ended, when my grandmother, Mrs. Shaw, passed away, because she wanted her ashes to be scattered in Swaziland. And then she saw a very different South Africa, at least from her perspective, where her black friend was the one in danger back in the 1950s. Now she was in equal danger, right? It was a dangerous place in that sort of very turbulent time when apartheid ended. So she saw it from many different perspectives.
And she had a genuine conversation and meaningful meeting with Nelson Mandela, who then was a young man.
Yeah, that was exactly a young lawyer, and not the man that we see, when we visualize him today, right? We all think of him as very thin and gray haired or white haired coming out of prison. But back then he was not not overweight, but a very good weight, and young and black hair and all of that, a very different person. Um, but what was the same about him before he went to prison as when he came out of prison was that his smile was so gregarious, so attractive, and she just, he was charismatic, and everybody who talked to him felt like, that was their best friend. Um, but she was also going through a tough time when she met him because the government had just passed what's called the Bantu Education Act. They were trying to eliminate the mission schools from educating blacks in the white curriculum, and so she was going through basically a deportation process where they were putting pressure on her to get her out of the country. Um, and she shared that with Nelson Mandela, and shared a little story of what she had gone through with the white government inspectors who were giving her a hard time while she was teaching her class The Wind in the Willows, a children's story, but one of those stories that is timeless, is interesting for adults as it is. And she and Nelson Mandela had a good laugh about some parts of the story that they talked about.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and she's a remarkable lady. Uh, but let's begin to talk now more about your uncle. So uh, tell us about his early 20s and his 30s. How did he get started in acting? And we're also going to talk about playwriting because he was, although not as known for that, in reading this book, I recognize now that he was, a brilliant playwright as well. But how did he get started in the theater and acting?
Well, he got the acting bug, call it, at a very early age in the Orkney Islands. He was about 8 years old when a bunch of traveling troubadours, I guess you would call them, actors, came through their town, Stromness, little town in the Orkney Islands. And they put on a show for the kids in the afternoon, charged a penny, and charged, a few more pennies for the adults in the evening. And Robert went up on stage and started hamming it up, and the actors loved it, and started hamming it up with him, and the audience responded. And it's like one of those things where a light switch goes on. You're up on stage, you're in front of people, and they're cheering and laughing. And I think that was the moment that Robert knew he wanted to be an actor. And then in his teenage years, he did, the things that a lot of people do, high school plays and things like that, and that got him more into it. But let me tell you something. Of all the professions that somebody growing up and living in Cornwall at the time in southernmost Britain, in a very rural part of Britain, of all the professions that you could go into, being a doctor, like his father, was at the very top. And that is what his mother desperately wanted him and pushed him to be. And the very bottom of the barrel was acting. Actors back in that day were considered, well, like the traveling troubadours, a bunch of phony people, just getting on stage in front of a few people. So if his mother had had her way, he would have become a doctor and done that. But he took a year off, didn't go to university, was a teacher in the London school system, absolutely hated it, but it got him for not a lot of money. This is like in the 1946, 1947. So World War II has ended. The Marshall Plan is rebuilding London, and actors like Alec Guinness and John Gielgud and Peggy Ashcroft and Michael Redgrave are performing every night. And, Robert started to go and see them and absolutely loved it. He applied to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art a year later and got in with a scholarship. And from there, it was, his career well, it didn't take off because for the first 5 years, when he graduated from RADA, Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, he performed nothing but Shakespeare for about 5 years, and with and multiple performances every night, and with the same people that he'd been going to see as a young man, John Gielgud, Alec Guinness, right, the greatest actors of that time, or maybe of all time, right? But certainly of that time. So his training was, it could not have been better working with those people. And
And
from
they
there,
saw something in him. It's from reading your book. They saw something in him. I think that they knew he had potential, stardom, or at least a great actor in him.
yeah, yeah, we talked earlier, he got a lot of his sort of charisma, his storytelling, his accents from his father, and he got his courage and determination from his mother. And that came across, very, very well on the stage. And he got a lot of offers in those first 5 years from, some of those great actors. But he also went through a bit of a lull after several years because those same leading actors who saw what you just mentioned, Louis, that he had a stage presence, he had a charisma, he was somebody that you were interested in watching. He spoke, very well. But he also tended to take the spotlight away from the leading actors at times. And they didn't like that so much. And they didn't like his brashness and his brutal honesty. Again, got that from his mother. And so he went into a bit of a lull in his late 20s and decided to take up writing. And to your point, became quite a successful and prolific writer. Wrote 5 novels and 3 plays. A couple of his novels were turned into movies. One of his plays ran on Broadway for a year and was nominated for a Tony Award. And I'm not sure if he would have even gotten into that if he hadn't sort of hit a snag in his career near the beginning in his late 20s, and that propelled him into the writing
It sounds
game.
like he took great pride in that, and in fact, thought of perhaps as much pride or more in the fact that he had won a Tony or been nominated than some of his other movie accolades. What was the play he won the Tony for?
The Man in the Glass Booth. It started as a novel, and he turned it into a play at my mother's suggestion, actually. She thought it was, it's a very interesting story. Are you familiar with it, Louis? Shall I
Well,
just
just from
describe
reading
it
your
briefly?
book, just from reading the book. Tell us
Yeah, yeah.
briefly the
Yeah,
synopsis.
so yeah, it's sort of the reverse of the Adolf Eichmann story, if I've got the right first name for Eichmann. Eichmann was one of those Nazi generals who lied on the when in his trial. I was just following orders. I didn't have anything to do with it, et cetera, et cetera. And so what Robert did with the Man in the Glass Booth was he took a Jewish man, a Holocaust survivor, who then pretends to be a Nazi general so that he can be put on trial and do the opposite of what Eichmann did. He told exactly the truth about what happened in the concentration camps. And you know, Robert Shaw was not the kind of person to shy away from controversy, and he went right after that one with that. And Yeah, I think being nominated for the Tony Award for writing that play, not for acting in it, might have been the highlight of his career. He thought of writing as the epitome of the arts.
As an actor, when he was on the stage or in the movies, did he follow the lines or did he improvise?
Oh, well, I think that depends on the movie and the writer. Um, it's like, and I'll take two different examples. With He did a lot of Harold Pinter, right? Harold Pinter was the well-known British playwright and director, among other things. And he did a number of Harold Pinter plays and movies. And he would always say with Harold Pinter that the writing is so good that you have to, follow it exactly to the point where if there's an apostrophe, you got to pause. And, the writer is telling you to pause there. So in a Harold Pinter production, I don't think he would ad lib at all. He certainly said he didn't. On the other hand, Carl Gottlieb, the screenwriter for Jaws, told me once, and I got to know Carl a little bit, that because they were writing the script, or rewriting the script nightly while they were shooting Jaws, and the characters were so well drawn, right? Quint and Hooper and Brody, that all three of the actors could ad lib quite a bit when they then said their lines the next day. So, Louis, I think it all depends on the movie, the director, and the quality of the writing.
We're gonna talk about Jaws obviously in a minute, but there were some other movies. I think this role of Quint has sort of come to, in the public mind, sort of embellish or in represent Robert Shaw. But there were some other wonderful movies. He starred in one of the early James Bond movies, From Russia with Love, or To Russia
Yeah.
with Love, as maybe the most brutal opponent Sean Connery's 007 ever had. He plays a platinum blonde assassin sent to kill Bond, and they have a brutal fight.
Yeah.
But the two men actually became friends, I believe, and later they were in wonderful 1976 film Robin and Marion, where he plays Sheriff of Nottingham, arch rival to Sean Connery's Robin Hood, where they have, I think, the most realistic sword fight ever filmed
Oh, really? Oh.
toward the end. If I'm sure you've seen it.
Oh, yeah.
Were they friends, he and Sean Connery?
Yes, they were, and so in in Robin and Marion, right? That they got to he got to act with Audrey Hepburn,
Sure.
and I read once that Audrey Hepburn later said that it was one of her favorite movies to make because she got to be in a film with James Bond and Quint in the same
Well,
movie.
it really is a wonderful film for those who haven't seen it.
Yeah.
And there were a number of other highly acclaimed movies. I believe he was nominated for an Academy Award for Man of All Seasons. He played King Henry VIII, and that was a great movie. So along the way, before he became Quint, he really had an established movie career with all sorts of different roles, right? Good people, bad
Yeah.
people. Although mostly, I would say mostly heavies of one kind or
Yeah.
another.
Yeah, yeah, he had an imposing, right, sort of personality, and so yes, you mentioned From Russia with Love with Sean Connery. That was actually the second project that they did together. The first one was a TV movie that was based on Robert's first novel, The Hiding Place, and made into a movie in Britain, starring Sean Connery and Robert. And then Sean Connery returned the favor by helping Robert become the heavy, like you said, in From Russia with Love. And on that fight on the train, by the way, Lewis, one of the funny little stories is that Robert, in his early 20s, so maybe 10 years before that movie was made, had dated Sean Connery's wife. And so what he said to us was, and I remember this as a kid, he said to get him like really, angry for that train, for the fight on the train, he
Right.
started telling Sean about some stories about his wife before Sean ever knew her. And he wouldn't say what he had said, right? As an Englishman and a gentleman, I'm not at liberty to talk about that. So, but yes, he and Sean Connery were good friends. And the other one you mentioned, A Man for All Seasons, where he plays Henry VIII, he's only on camera for about 20 minutes in a 2.5 hour movie, but it is the most captivating 20 minutes you'll ever watch, in a movie theater, because Henry VIII has to be both have the royal backing and the feeling that this is really a king, and at the same time be a little bit out of his mind and scary. Like you do not want to go up against this guy or you will lose your head. Um, and then, the other big one that he did was The Sting, right, with Paul
Of
Newman and
course, I'm
Robert
sorry.
Redford.
Yeah, of course, with
And
Robert Redford and Paul Newman. Again,
yeah,
playing
yeah, and
a rather
Paul
scary
Newman.
guy.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Again, playing a rather scary guy.
Yeah, exactly. And Paul Newman helped him get that role, suggested him for the role to the producers. Just by the happenstance of Paul's character in the movies, his last name was Shaw. Made him think of Robert Shaw, whom he knew. And Robert ended up getting the part. And then the two producers, Zanuck and Brown, were the same producers for Jaws. And, lo and behold, Robert, goes from The Sting and into Jaws.
All right, so let's talk about that shark. So the producers already knew him. They were casting this movie with a very young director, Steven Spielberg, who was at that point essentially unknown. And what was Quint the part that he wanted?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I think
And
it was the standout part in the movie. And
did he know that before the movie started?
yeah, I mean, he'd read the book,
Wow.
right?
He eventually
I
started.
remember reading that book too. What was I, 17 years old at the
Yeah.
time, and an English major at Trinity College, right? But I was reading the summer reading books too. And yeah, Quint stood out, I think, both in the book and then in the movie as being the most interesting character. So he definitely wanted that role.
So he comes on set, and there have been a lot written about the making of that movie, and of course there have been documentaries now on the 50th anniversary. Um,
Yeah.
and we'll talk about it in a minute. Perhaps your nephew, Ian Shaw, that
Yep.
that your nephew has did a one-person show that ended up on Broadway a few years ago, called "The
Yep.
Shark Is Broken," I believe. About
Yes.
and Ian, by the way, looks eerily like his dad, right?
It
I
does,
mean,
I know.
so that
Yep.
that helps sell it. But there's been so much written about the making of that movie behind the scenes, and you do talk obviously in the book about that. But can you talk a little bit more what it was like for him to be there and making that movie?
Well, he thought it was going to be a 6 week shoot, and it turned into 6 months. Much of it out on the ocean. So it, it it wasn't the best of times for him, right? Being on the water every day for 6, 8, 10 hours in order to get in some, maybe an hour of camera time, sometimes no camera time at all, right? For all the reasons that, people have talked about. The shark wasn't working, the sailboats were in the way, the weather had changed, it was raining, whatever. Um, and he had, uh, as a British actor, he was subject to both British and United States tax, laws. And uh, he thought he was only going to be on set for 6 weeks and he would be able to avoid being double taxed by the US and Britain. And then the 6 months meant that he was, so a lot of it, he wasn't happy. Um, but in general, I would say Robert Shaw, he struck me always, and my mother and aunts and uncles who knew him better than I did, as being a pretty happy person. And he was enjoying himself in many other ways, playing golf and drinking and whatnot. But the happenstance of how my mother. So listen, the part of the book that deals with the Jaws production, for the most part, is the firsthand observations of my mother and my grandmother, who were on the set for a week with him. And to your earlier point, Louis, everybody has weighed in on what happened on the set of Jaws. You hear Spielberg talk about it in that documentary, and many other times, and Dreyfuss and Scheider and whatnot. Robert died 3 years after Jaws and never really spent a lot of time talking about it. So this is sort of his, view of what went on, but through the eyes of his sister and his mother and what they observed being with him on the set for that week. And it was all the things that, we've heard about, the just boredom of being,
Yeah.
sitting in a boat, waiting for your turn on camera for hours and hours and hours with nothing to do. Um, and No, but lots of colorful characters. Richard Dreyfuss was a very good friend of Robert's. There's a myth that says that they didn't like each other.
Right.
That's true at all. They were actually very good friends.
Right.
Um, and I think that myth grew up because put them into costume, right? And, Robert becomes Quint and Dreyfuss becomes Hooper. And then they don't like each other. So if anybody was on the set watching them once they got into costume, they would have seen, them clashing. But take them out of costume and put them at lunch or dinner or, anywhere where they're not in costume, and they liked each other enormously.
Well, I was very glad that you made that point in the book. It sort of disabused the other myth. Um, the famous scene, it's perhaps one of the most well-known scenes in the movie, is him talking about the Indianapolis, the sinking of the Indianapolis. Um, and he had helped write that
Yeah,
passage, correct?
yeah,
So
correct.
he pulled on his playwriting ability to help write, what was a remarkable scene, and then he carried it off. There were rumors that he had been drinking heavily the night before and maybe even the morning of the shoot. True or not?
Well, true. But I'm telling you that because that's well known. My mother and grandmother were not present at that time. But yeah, that was a 2-day film shoot. And the first day, and listen, it's a scene in which the three men are drinking together in the ship's cabin at night. And Robert said to Spielberg, "Hey, I think, we should be drinking for this." And Spielberg said, "Okay." And Robert took it too far and was quite drunk the first day. I saw something that Spielberg said that really struck me as being just so interesting. He said that Robert called him up at 3 o'clock in the morning after the first day of filming, not remembering, he had drunk so much that he didn't remember. And Spielberg said, the first thing he said to me was, "Stephen, did I embarrass you?" And, he didn't start by saying, "Did I embarrass myself?" "Did I embarrass you, Stephen?" And that was the kind of person Robert was. He was, thinking about the other person before
Yeah,
himself.
yeah.
Um, and then the second day, they filmed it again, and he was perfectly sober. And my understanding is that they've taken some footage from the first day and some footage from the second day in the editing process to put together arguably one of the most interesting scenes in film history.
I
I certainly.
I think I would agree with that. Um, the last scene where he gets eaten by the shark, no spoiler alerts. At any rate, he almost drowned. Is that right? Or
Yeah, he certainly claimed to have almost drowned.
almost drowned?
Uh, yeah, exactly. Um, yeah, yeah. That was a scene again that my mother and grandmother watched, and were horrified, right? Seeing their brother, their son, being dragged into the water with screaming and in a shark's mouth and blood or whatever it is that they bite down on. I'm sure it's not real blood, but And so later that night, Robert and my mother are just taking a walk on the beach, right? And the sun's gone down and the water's lapping next to them and whatnot. And she says very casually, "Great acting out there today. Your screams seem so real." And Robert's response was, "Yeah, they were real. I was terrified." And what he said was that he's being dragged into the ocean by a bloody mechanical contraption, quote unquote, that
Which
had never
wasn't
worked
working
from
well to
day
begin
one.
with, right?
And all he had, in case something went wrong and he got dragged underwater, were a couple of scuba divers with, with an extra tank of oxygen. So that would be pretty scary, yeah. But did he almost drown? I don't know, but he claimed that he did.
Well, he carried it off and made a movie for the ages. Now, he would only live another 3 years. And those, tell us about those last 3 years from what you know.
Well, I did not see much of him in his last three. I saw a lot of him during my childhood and my teenage years. Um, I'm the oldest child of seven children in my mother's and father's family. And so, being the oldest, whenever Robert was in New York, we lived in Philadelphia. Whenever Robert usually in New York City, although sometimes he came through Philadelphia, my mother would take me on the train with her, and I'd sit in hotel rooms and hotel lobbies and restaurants and listen to the two of them talking usually about their childhood or complaining about their mother, but always with just enormous laughter, right? And But then I went to Trinity College right when Jaws came out, right? 1975 in September I started. The movie came out in June. And then I didn't really see him for the last 3 years. I just wasn't home and wasn't available. Um, my mother continued to see him, and he was having a hard time, I think, in life at that point. His second wife had died of an accidental overdose, and he remarried a third time to another remarkable woman. But that was a tough period in his life, and he was continuing to drink, and he died of a heart attack on a very remote road in the westernmost part of Ireland, where the nearest, and this is in 1978, so before cell phones, before 9/11, 911 calls, and 30 miles or more from the nearest hospital. He'd probably be alive today, right? If, with the
How old was
technology
he when
we
he
have.
died?
He was 51 years old.
51 years old.
Yeah.
The Before we end, this wonderful picture. Tell me what you see in that picture.
Yeah, he's a character, isn't he? Yeah, he exudes confidence. He's his own person. Nobody is ever going to tell him what to do. And at the same time, he's got sort of a casual confidence. Yeah, I love that photo. My publisher, thought of putting that on the cover, and it does take advantage of the Jaws anniversary. It's also a little misleading because, to your point, Louis, this is more. In fact, what I like to tell people is there should be a warning label. This is not your typical biography. It's not a biography that's going to focus solely on, that person and go through every aspect of their life. This is a biography that brings family members into the story and tells their story as well. And and so, sort of the downside for somebody who is just an absolute Jaws fan is if they want to read 300 pages of Jaws, they're not going to get it. The upside is that the rest of Robert Shaw's family had very interesting lives of their own, especially the women in his life, his sisters and his mother. And that's number one. And the other upside is that, the goal of this is not to describe everything that happened in his life, but to make the reader feel like they knew him personally. And because it's told from the perspective of family. And 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 by the way, Robert Shaw was the kind of person that I grew up thinking everybody loved him because I adored him. And I just assumed everybody felt exactly the same way. And then I learned later on that actually some people really did not like him at all. It was sort of you either loved him or you hated him, and nobody had, this reaction of, oh, I never really thought too much about him. Um, and somebody with a very big personality, who can, come on very strong. And I think the people who really enjoyed his company were the people who were equally confident, equally strong in their own characters. People like Sean Connery, like you mentioned, and Steven Spielberg and Richard Dreyfuss, who got along very well with him. Very confident people who could take his big personality and then kind of give it back to him, which he loved, right? But this is the kind of biography where you're going to come away with either a liking, really liking him, or maybe not, but you'll feel like you knew him.
Well, I think it's a wonderful book. I hope people will have a chance to read it. I would say cheers to you and your family and your wonderful, lovely mother, Joanna, if she gets a chance to see this program. So thank you so much for being here with us. Chris Shaw Myers with the book about his wonderful uncle, remarkable uncle, Robert Shaw. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis. It was a pleasure.